Hi y'all, Raidwald here. I came across this video by Success Council. It's directed to that guy T, and poses a difficult question for ANCAPs. Even though he didn't address it to me, I thought I would step in and give my opinion on it.
Hey, that guy team. My name is Max. I'm from YouTube channel Success Council, and I'm a fellow NCAP. I recently came across an argument which I think sufficiently neuters the philosophical position of NCAP, and so I wanted to run it past you, see if you had a good defense for it. The argument goes something along the lines of this. I think most NCAPs agree that the concept of a HOA or a homeowners association is a philosophically moral construct, meaning I can choose to buy a condominium in a condominium building or a lot of land on a gated community or a non-gated community or something like that. And I voluntarily agree to abide by the rules of that association, and I'm obligated to pay dues, and I abide by those rules. And that was sufficient for me for a long time, but I've noticed of late that it occurs to me that it's really a distinction without a difference between an HOA and a country. The only distinction and difference that I can see, really, is that the practicality and the scale of it. If there's 200 of them, we call it a country. If there's 200 million of them, we call them an HOA.
Hi Max. So first of all, I'm fairly new to the to the YouTube community, and I'm also fairly new to the ANCAP community. All the same, among the few lessons I have learned thus far, is when you see something that seems a little fishy, you first have to start asking yourself, is the free market at work? Alright? So, first, before we dive into distinctions between government and HOAs, let's first establish whether or not HOAs would likely exist or exist in the same way under free market conditions. One of the very first things you'll notice is that yes, they did exist as early as the mid-19th century, but that they didn't really start to grow until there was a huge push for large-scale residential development by the Federal Housing Authority. Right, so already you've got government and coercive interference with the free market, pushing people into housing. Next, the Federal Housing Administration in 1963 authorized federal home mortgage insurance exclusively for condominiums and for homes in subdivisions where there is a qualifying homeowner association. So again, the federal government is now pushing for people to live in a homeowners association. Local governments started to promote it because the associations tended to provide services that formerly had been paid by the local governments, funded by property taxes. So the associations are taking over those responsibilities, but the residents were still required to pay those taxes. In other words, the government is seeing an opportunity here to lower their costs, but while still maintaining their revenue, which ultimately improves their cash flow. So you've got local and federal governments both pushing people into homeowners associations. And then, on top of all this, there's the U.S. Clean Water Act of 1977. It required new developments to detain stormwater just to make sure that the flow to the adjoining properties was no more than it was prior to the development. And what that did is it forced the creation of infrastructure in almost all residential developments, and this infrastructure had to serve multiple residences, right? So although they could be put on a single person's private property, everybody could put it on their own private property. The need for maintaining and the fact that it's kind of a commonly owned thing almost demands it to be built by the municipality or by a homeowners association. And what's happened is, over time, nearly all U.S. municipalities actually require these to be part of a common area. That way, they're able to push the maintenance responsibility onto a homeowners association. So, just based off of this little bit of history, I think we're seeing that, yes, there would be a place for homeowners associations in a completely free market. However, with the degree of government laws and actual literal financial subsidies, there's been an amalgamation of power, an imbalance of power given to these large developers, which again have been subsidized by the government, not only directly through financial incentives, but also indirectly through the passing of laws and regulations that kind of drive people towards them. And so I think it's highly unlikely that homeowners associations would exist in the same way that they do now in a free market. Now, as for distinctions to government and HOAs, first of all, there's an actual signed contract. This is not in any way comparable to the rather nebulous and non-existent social contract that people supposedly consented to without, actually consenting to. There is a signed document where one person gave consent on their own behalf to the organization. This contract binds that organization in a way that social contracts and even constitutions fail to do so with the government. In large part because they're going to be enforced by a third party, right? We're not talking about a branch of the government deciding whether or not the government has hurt somebody else. So there's that. There's the fact that they will not be enforced by imprisonment, right? Nobody's giving the HOAs authority to kidnap them, and it is highly unlikely that they will also ever resort to physical violence to enforce them, though if there were fines or liens against the property or something where they needed to start seizing assets, it's conceivable that somebody could pull a gun and there could, be violence subsequent to that. But it's not going to start at the level of violence or at the level of kidnapping. So that's a pretty big distinction there as well.
And this really got highlighted to me recently when I realized the depth and breadth of the contracts and things that go into HOAs. So I was recently visiting my in-laws, and they live in a really nice private community. And it's not gated. People can come and go as they please. However, there are rules in there. One of the rules was you're not allowed to rent out your house. They want everybody to be owner-occupiers. And when I first heard that, I was like, knee-jerk reaction. I was like, what? The HOA tells you what you can do in your own house? And then I thought, hang on a minute, all the gardens are beautifully manicured, and this is an incredibly nice place to live. And actually, yeah, I'd like to live here. This is a great rule. I would sign up to this HOA. And then I thought, well, where does this end? It's like, well, okay, so I wanted to see the distinctions between an HOA and a country, and really try to grab onto something that meant there's a significant difference there. And I couldn't really come up with it. I mean, if a HOA wanted to charge, rather than, $1,000 a year for, depending on your lot size or whatever the usual rules are for HOAs, if they said, we're going to charge proportional to your income and you have to submit, tax returns, then everybody who chose to live in that HOA would have to oblige.
True, but the HOA is going to actually be limited by market forces. Governments tend not to be, because, with an HOA, you have the terms and conditions of the contract literally spelled out in front of you, and you have to sign it and purchase the land there. And if they include clauses that allow them to change those terms out from under you, then it's easier to sell your house and move to another local neighborhood than it is to quit your job and move off into Antarctica, where you won't be governed by another entity. Simply put, an HOA can actually demonstrate the consent of the governed. And on top of this, the terms of this contract are going to be enforceable not just on the residents or the citizens, if you will. It's going to be enforceable on the developer, or in your analogy, the government. Which, because the social contract is so nebulous and non-existent, we run into the situation where the government can enforce it on us through taking our liberty or our lives, as well as our property. So they can enforce it by doing these things when we are said to have broken the terms of this undefined contract. But when they have broken the terms of that undefined contract, well, A, they really haven't broken it because there is no terms, and B, we really have no means of enforcing anything on them, right? Yeah, we can vote them out and vote somebody else in, but they go off, they retire, they get a very, very nice pension. There's just really no accountability in government, and as much as people can complain about HOAs, and as much as some people may be perfectly happy with their HOAs, one thing you can say is that they're going to tend to be way more accountable to free market forces and to the desires of their customers.
And so I struggled to find a philosophical difference between an HOA and a country. And that causes a real problem for me. Because the only way, for several reasons. One, a practical reason. The only way I can see society working, I can't imagine society working without HOAs and people coming together to form voluntary communities and abiding by rules that they've volunteered to agree to.
Well, it's a good thing that the free market isn't constrained by what you can or cannot imagine. I don't want the market to be constrained by what I can imagine. I could, and frankly, I could see other ways of it happening. It doesn't have to be privately owned cities like Walt Disney World.
Now, philosophically, if we say that HOAs are a valid construct and people can voluntarily choose to be part of this community, and even if, remember, if you buy a lot of land or buy a condominium and you pass away and your heirs get that condominium, they inherit the rules as well. Now, they can choose to sell that piece of property and move elsewhere.
Yeah, and it's not the only contractual obligation that will follow property, right? Bank loans and the like will also follow property, and that's perfectly fine. The big difference between what we see in government and what we see here is again, just I have to point to the consent of the governed, right? Yes, the contractual obligations can follow the property, but when you accept the inheritance of that property, you have actively implied consent to a contract. My consent to the government is entirely different, right? It was just assumed through my passivity. In other words, there is no point in my life where you can actually point at an action I took, something I actively did to show consent to the government. It's just assumed that I passively accepted it by not running away to Antarctica as soon as I came of reasonable age of consent, right? Again, with HOAs, somebody initially signed the contract, and in the case of inheritance, somebody accepted the property and didn't sell it, right? So this is a case where you could actually make a case for an implied contract. Also, any conflict I have with an HOA, that conflict can be decided by a third-party mediator. There is no third-party mediator for governments, right? If there is a conflict between me and the government, then I go to the government to figure out who's in the wrong. And oddly enough, that seems to generally go in the favor of the government. In other words, it'll just be easier to keep a handle on things. You can separate out those powers from an HOA far more easily, and if it's a contract, it'll be decided and defended in court in the same way any other contract will. And the concept of unconscionability will actually apply here. If you've got terms of a contract which were foisted onto a weaker party by a stronger party, then the court can easily look at that and just say, well, this is unreasonable. Nobody would really agree to this, and they could just toss it out. So, yeah, I do see a lot of philosophical differences.
Now that's true of countries. You can leave a country and go to find other rules. The only thing that NCAPs are annoyed at is that, well, there's only 200 or 300 HOAs to choose from, and it's not a very competitive market.
More along the lines of it's a quote-unquote market that destroys market accountability wherever it can, as well as its competition, that does not require consent of any meaningful type from any of its so-called customers, and that's the final word on interpretation of the non-existent contract that exists. It gets the right to enforce that contract on you, while you do not have a similar right to enforce it on them, and they get to change the terms of the contract at any point for any reason whatsoever. The only kind of accountability they have is to make sure they don't make us so mad that we rise up in arms against them. That's really the only limiting factor on them. That's all they have to worry about. And even there, they can rely on inertia, right? Most of us are not currently rebelling, so it would take a bit of a kick in the pants to get us to a state of rebellion. And the fact that we want, self-preservation, right? Nobody wants to risk their neck to die unless things are really, really going wrong.
If I do choose to get up and leave this country for greener pastures and place where I think the rules are more to my satisfaction, I've got to give up my social network, probably my job, all of my friends, and it's a huge effort. And so all that an NCAP really asks for is that we just want lots of competition. What I'd love is, I don't like this HOA, well, I'll go 3 miles down the road and I like that HOA better. I don't have to give up my job, I don't have to give up my friends, I don't have to give up my knowledge of the city. It's a practical answer and not a philosophical answer.
Actually, I, for one, I don't really have an issue with monopolies, right? Even if there was one government under which 90% of the world's population lived, if there was real market competition and real market accountability, then the only assumption you could arrive at is that this government is satisfactorily meeting those needs. Right? The problem is that governments excuse themselves from market accountability through the use of force. They get to enforce their own contract, they get to interpret their own contract, they get to rewrite the terms of the contract even after the supposed consent of the people was given, right? And frankly, their argument for how we gave consent and when we gave consent, it's not even bad, it's just non-existent. They just throw a phrase out to us, social contract, and expect that to explain it all. And that's kind of where we are in society right now. And when it comes right down to it, moving to another country really isn't even enough anymore. The U.S. will still hunt you down and get income taxes from you. And, they'll give you a deductible based on the fact that you're already paying an income tax in the country you're in, but you have to jump through their hoops to renounce your citizenship, and really they can make that as hard or as easy as they want and still coerce you into paying taxes for them as long as that process is going on. I mean, they are so free from any real kind of accountability that they're able to do things that are hated left, right, and center and continue doing that with no signs of stopping.
So if you arrive at this point, which I have kind of arrived at, which is there's no philosophical distinction between an HOA and a country, well, now you get to the conclusion that the fact that we just have 200 or 300 countries on the planet is a market failure, or that's what I'm advocating. It's like the world would be better if there would be hundreds of millions of smaller HOAs instead of 200 or 300 big HOAs we call countries. And so if I try and win that argument, well, now I'm just saying I'm right and the market's wrong and it's a market failure. That doesn't make sense. So now I go, well, okay, if I subscribe to the fact that, the market's pretty much always right, why do we only have 200 or 300 countries? And then I think, well, okay, maybe my concept of, best organizations for national defense, and in order to thwart and throw off attack from foreign armies, etc. Maybe it requires a little bit more than just a conglomeration of HOAs or whatever, because either way I'm stuck. I either say, well, it's a market failure, and that has consequences to the libertarian argument, or I say that, well, actually the market's right, and the best way to organize ourselves is with this, let's say, limited competition of HOAs, 300 countries.
Okay, I'm going to let the cat out of the bag, perhaps a little prematurely here, on an idea that I've been stewing over for a while and haven't really gotten around to making an academic defense of yet. And you know what, who knows, when I get into deep research on this, it may prove to not be true. But I think what's going on is you're coming from the basic Lockean position that productive people created a government in order to better defend their property, so they didn't have to worry about it, right? It is basic division of labor, and they just wanted somebody else to deal with it. I look at more... I believe that the evidence points to a situation more along the lines of you have family groups that are productive and feeding themselves, and other family groups that are based on raiding and stealing the money from those who did. So you get these few groups that are going around and harassing the others and taking their stuff and subsisting off of that stuff, because you can get a lot of stuff very quickly with a relatively small amount of effort put forth. And so what happened is, over time, the productive people didn't like dying, and the non-productive people also didn't like dying. So they kind of came to these agreements. Well, you pay us a tribute, and we'll leave you alone. In fact, we'll not just leave you alone. We'll go ahead and make sure that nobody else raids you, because we're protecting our turf. We see the same thing playing out with modern mafias and organized crime, and we also this is exactly how governments seem to work. Not to mention, there's plenty of historical evidence for, even before a government is fully taking the claim of jurisdiction over an area, they're more than happy to send out raiding parties and steal from neighboring groups, particularly neighboring smaller groups. And over time, you do see these situations where, instead of fighting going on either side, there's an agreement on both sides that, okay, fine, we'll pay you every raiding season to just pass us by. You see this in a couple of specific examples that come to my mind. You see this in the Carolingians' relationship with the bordering Saxons, and you also see this in in the Viking raids, right? Vikings would be happy to pass your village by if you came out and paid them the money to leave you alone. If you didn't, they would rape and slaughter and kill and steal. So, anyway, I see the origins of government more along the lines of, we're going to start extracting a tribute from you rather than risking our lives to kill you and steal it. And we'll go ahead and protect our own interests, our tributes, by making sure nobody else is raiding on our turf. Over time, these groups that were raiding, these non-productive groups, started to use this extreme degree of wealth to build up city centers. And they attempted to draw as many people as they could into these city centers, because it tends to get, it's easier to control people who are close in and centralized than it is to control people who are largely decentralized. And next thing you know, you have a government. No consent, just a demonstrated preference to not die.
So I've been battling with this question for the last few months. Haven't really come up with any solutions. I thought I'd reach out to yourself because I really appreciate your channel. Really appreciate what you're doing. I enjoy it. So yeah, if you had any thoughts, I'd really appreciate hearing from you. Oh, and if you do check out my channel, the last year or two I've been a bit lazy with videos and there's been a lot of Bitcoin stuff. Years before I've done some really good stuff on ANCAP and libertarian philosophy, so I think you might enjoy those if you do get a chance to look at them. But I'd love to hear your opinion. Thanks for joining in. Bye.
All right. Thanks for watching. I hope I sufficiently answered your questions. If you liked it, please rate the video, leave all comments below, and if you really just loved it, please consider supporting this channel through a small donation at my Patreon, link below. Thanks. We'll see y'all later.